before I introduce today's guest. Our sponsor, our app, Great Courses Plus. You just click on the app. The app is free, of course, and you can access hundreds and hundreds of courses, each of which have a dozen or 24 lectures. I popped one up here today because it's apropos of my guest, who's an economist. This is the Economic History of the World since 1400. Now, this is a course. It's 48 lectures long. Each lecture is about 30 minutes. As I always say, I like to listen to them at 1.2 speed, so it's about 20 minutes. Perfect for a commute, drive, or workout. You can knock off 2 or 3 in a day and get through this whole 48 lecture course and become knowledgeable on the economic history of the world. It's a great source of information. And if you get bored with the course, you can just skip to a different course. And so here's the deal. If you subscribe to the Great Courses Plus program through my website, you get a free trial and 20% off the annual subscription. Comes out to about $30 a year, discounted. And so you do that by accessing it through the greatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. So free trial, 20% off. The subscription for the year, which gives you access to all these great courses, thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. Okay. I said this was appropriate because my guest is an economist. She is, in fact, Minouche Shafik, an Egyptian-born British-American economist who served as the deputy governor of the Bank of England from 2014 to 2017 and has served as the director of the London School of Economics since September 2017. Born in Alexandria, Egypt, Shafik studied at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the London School of Economics before receiving her doctorate from St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Shafik served as the permanent secretary of the Department of International Development from March 2008 to March 2011, when she went on to serve as the deputy managing director of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. She joined the Bank of England as its first deputy governor on markets and banking, responsible for the bank's £500 billion balance sheet, and served as a member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, Financial Policy Committee, and board of the Prudential Regulatory Authority. She led the bank's Fair and Effective Markets Review to tackle misconduct in financial markets. Now, I gave you a longer bio than I usually do for my guests because her book is called What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society. She has convinced me this is very doable in our lifetime, and she outlines exactly how we could do it. So we go through that. We go through what is a social contract, the history of the idea of social contract, the interactions between government and business and corporations and individuals, and really who is the we that owes each other. I push back. I just pretend to be channel my inner conservative, which I'm not, but just channel what people who are conservatives tell me and just throw that at her. And she has great responses to all these things. Income inequality, and what about welfare systems? What about universal basic income? What about generational wealth and reparations for those like in America who were slaves, or in her country's perspective, colonies? What about the architecture of choice, libertarian paternalism, and to what extent we can offer people choices from which they could choose that are beneficial to them and good for society? Talk about minimum wage and how economists think about minimum wage, and modern monetary theory and how that's supposed to work. How is it possible the government can print trillions of dollars and distribute them to its citizens during the pandemic, or what we're about to do for infrastructure upgrades? How can that happen without massive inflation? Well, she outlines how that could happen. And then we finish up talking about the future, the end of poverty, and will we eventually live in a post-poverty world that is just endless wealth, so much wealth we can't even conceive of it now. Is that even possible? So with that, please enjoy this conversation. Minouche, thanks for coming on the show.
Very nice. Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. I really enjoy your show, actually. It's fantastic.
Oh gosh, thanks. I appreciate that. Yes. Well, your publicist sends me a lot of authors, and I've never had anyone on the show quite like you. You have quite the personal background. I usually have academic eggheads, of which you are one, but you also work in the trenches. I mean, you're actually one of these people that makes policy changes that matter. And, looking through your bio, London School of Economics, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of England, managing 500 billion pounds of money for foreign aid and so on. You are the Illuminati, aren't you? Admit it. Come on, you're secretly running the world.
If I am, they haven't told me.
That's really funny.
I didn't know what the Illuminati was until another teenage son told me about them. And I was like, really? I never heard of that before.
Yes. Well, there is a sense that I think one explanation for conspiracy theories like the Illuminati is that I wouldn't say more comforting, but it's just kind of easier to grasp that instead of a complex system like economics where no one really understands why the price of gasoline goes up or down or why the stock market's doing this or that. After the fact, you can predict it, post-dict it. But before, even people like you with PhDs in economics struggle and disagree with each other. So it's easier to think, well, there's just these 12 people in London that, run the world.
Yeah. Well, having sat in some meetings in which there are lots of powerful people, my lesson from life is that it's almost never a conspiracy. It's almost always cock-up.
Right. It's, it's kind of scary to think nobody's in charge, right?
Well, I think that's a more realistic interpretation.
Yes. Well, and another thing that fuels conspiracy theories is power. Who has it? And, money is power also. So, a lot of conspiracy theories have to do with politics and economics, who's controlling the money and who gets what money and how they get it and so on. And so, one of my pet projects, sort of lifelong, I may write a book about this, of how lives turn out, genetics, environment, and luck. So at the beginning, your first chapter, you talk about growing up in Egypt and then revisiting your mother's family's town, and there's girls that look like you, or young women that look like you that didn't have the pathway you had. So just start us off with a little biographical background of how you got to be, who you are with this incredible standing in the world from, your more humble origins and how that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think my story is one where there's quite a lot of chance. I was born into a family that was relatively well off in Egypt, and then in the 1960s, my father was nationalized in the revolution in Egypt, where Nasser took the property of all of the better off in society, and that led us to the United States. My father had done a PhD in the U.S. and and his old PhD supervisor actually said, if you come here, I can help you find a job. And we went from really being sort of on the top of the pile to a pretty humble existence in Savannah, Georgia, where we ended up first, where my mother turned up speaking only French and Arabic and no English whatsoever. And we went to the local schools. We kind of, worked our way up to being sort of middle class in the US. But really, I think for me, my salvation was education. I was one of those nerdy kids who loved to read. My mother took me to all the local libraries. I had memberships in lots of them. And that was my path to discover the world. And I sort of climbed the ladder of educational quality. I didn't go to good schools. I was growing up in the American South during desegregation and was bused to different schools every year. So some of which were okay, some of which were not so great. I went to not a very good, I graduated from a not very good high school, to be honest. Very few of my classmates went to university. I went to a state university, and then I went to the LSE and then Oxford. And for me, that climbing the ladder of educational quality was the path to success. And it was something I think my father instilled in me very early, because it was the same for him. If he hadn't had that PhD, he would have been destitute. and education was his salvation as well. And he would always say to me, they can take everything away from you except your education. So I think for me, that's the answer.
So, there's a big debate in America about, college admissions, to what extent they should use, SAT and standardized tests like that, GREs for graduate school. And then, we've just gone through this college scandal of parents, buying off this it turned out to be a con man, to get their kids into, elite Ivy League schools. And the story you just told shows that, well, you don't need to go to Harvard. There's a lot of parents who just think, if I don't get my kid into this grammar school that's a prep school for college, then he's not going to get into Harvard, and then our lives are ruined. And that's just such a ridiculous way to think. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I agree. On the other hand, I think what does matter more than where you happen to go to school is what the architecture of opportunity is in your society. And are you in a society in which everybody gets a fair chance? And in many ways, that's the key motivation, I think, or the key theme in my book, which is trying to understand what's gone wrong with the architecture of opportunity in our societies. Why does it, in the US, for example, take 5 generations for someone to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle? That's too long. I mean, 5 generations is not the American dream. But
that's an average, right? Because you did it in 1 generation.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But if I did it in 1, some people it takes 10. The averages work, of course. And so I think that's a really interesting question.
And on those studies, do they show education is the way to skip generations up to the top?
Well, I think education, and particularly in the very beginning of life, in the earliest years, and the opportunities you get exposed to very early on, are I believe, the biggest driver. And I think that's what most of the research shows. Of course, you have to then go into the job market where people are given equal opportunities and you don't face discrimination and all of that. But I do think education is the key.
So you get out of it. By the way, I meant to ask, when you're growing up in the South, Savannah, I've been to Savannah many times. Were you treated as just a typical white girl, or did they find you exotic? Because of the racial issues, were pretty bad back then and still tense.
It was. Well, it was very funny because I remember we lived in Savannah and Miami and North Carolina. And, in those days, I was a kid. I was outdoors all the time. I was very dark. And so I was always asked, are you black or white? And people wanted to put you in one box or the other. And I remember just being puzzled. I didn't know what to answer. I would say, well, I'm a little bit brown, really. But it was tense. And I remember being afraid going to school in those days.
Interesting, right? Because which category you're lumped into makes a big difference. At least it did at that time. How do Egyptians think about race?
It's an interesting question. Like in many societies, being fairer is preferable. And the further south you go in Egypt, the darker people get, because you start to get close to sub-Saharan Africa. And so there is definitely discrimination on the basis of color, but it's in a sort of narrower spectrum from kind of light brown to dark brown.
Interesting. Yeah, in the 90s, we did an issue of Skeptic on this book called Black Athena, which argued that when Plato visited Egypt, and got essentially Western logic and rationality and so on, he got it from Egyptians, and Egyptians were black. Well, sort of black, or anyway, it went on and on like this was like a 3-volume thing, so I'm oversimplifying. But Mary Lefkowitz, who's a historian of this period, she argued, that's a question Americans in the late 20th century would ask. What color are Egyptians? Egyptians would not have thought of themselves as black or white or whatever.
It's true. It's sort of imposing a modern set of categories on a past which was very different.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to kind of pivot in a weird direction, did you ever see the movie Moneyball? Michael Lewis's book about that Brad Pitt played the character in the film, where they didn't have Oakland A's didn't have much money, so they developed a kind of a statistical scientific way of picking players, and they ended up being very successful this way. But then soon everybody else was playing Moneyball, so it kind of leveled the playing field in terms of that strategy. But because you can other teams look at to see what works, and then let's copy what those guys are doing, and they did it within a matter of years. So I always wonder, why don't developing countries look to developed countries? It doesn't have to be America; it could be UK or Sweden or Norway or whatever, and go look at those guys. Their per capita GDP is 10 times what ours is, so we should do what they're doing. And so this gets into some of your work. Does anybody in these developing countries think like that? Like, let's do what they're doing. Let's bring in someone like Minouche and tell us exactly what we need to do so we can be like those guys.
Yeah, but definitely. I mean, there's definitely a huge amount of learning that goes on across countries. And many developing countries have built their economic systems inspired by models that they see around them, whether, it's trying to, learn from the educational system, for example, in the UK and France, or trying to copy the innovation in Silicon Valley, or learning about the way the Chinese have managed to develop these huge industrial zones. There's huge amounts of copying. And I think one of the best ways to develop is to look up. I mean, so many countries are so obsessed with their own problems, especially big countries. Big countries tend to be the most self-obsessed. I find smaller countries tend to be more open to looking elsewhere and stealing ideas from other successful countries. It's also a huge role in international organizations. Organizations like the World Bank or the IMF work globally, and part of their job is to distill the lessons of what's worked in one country and how can other countries benefit from it.
So what do organizations like the IMF do to solve these problems? I mean, just kind of walk us through a typical day, week, month, or whatever. Like, this is what we're going to do to help that country, and how do you pick who to try to help?
Right. So the IMF is an organization that monitors how countries' economies are doing and helps them during a crisis. And so, in a typical day, so just to give an example, there'll be IMF teams who are responsible for every country in the world. There'll be a team working on the US, and one working on Colombia, and another one working on Cambodia. And their job will be to monitor how that economy is doing. And every year they have to write a report on that economy. And it's like a health check. This is going well. Your budget deficit is getting a bit big. Your exports have fallen. You need to pay attention to that. Your banking system there looks okay, but there are these two banks that look a bit in trouble. And so they give a sort of health report for every economy in the world, with the idea that if you get an annual health check as an economy, you'll stay in better shape. It's like going to your doctor for a physical. But every once in a while, countries have heart attacks. And when they have heart attacks, they have an overdraft facility at the IMF, and they can draw on money from the IMF to tide them over until they've sorted out how to deal with their heart attack. That's a sort of very simple version of it. The other thing the IMF does more and more is that we've realized, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, is that when one country has a heart attack, it tends to spill over onto others. And because the world economy is so interconnected, they do a lot of what they call multilateral surveillance, which basically means looking at how economies around the world are interconnected, and how, if one bit of the world economy is in trouble, how that might spill over onto other bits, mainly through stock markets, banking system, trade flows, and so on.
So would Greece in 2008, 2009 be an example? I mean, how does a country go bankrupt?
Yeah, it's a perfect example. In fact, I worked on Greece when I was at the IMF, and Greece is a perfect example where uh, the Greek economy had been cushioned as part of the European Union, and had been spending more than it could really afford. It was able to borrow very cheaply because it was part of the euro and was able to borrow perhaps more cheaply than it would have on its own standing. And at one point, that as you say, effectively, it sort of went bankrupt. It became unsustainable, and no one was willing to lend to Greece anymore because they realized that the likelihood of being paid back was very low. And as you know, as is often the case when you reach that situation, you have to figure out how to restore balance, and so that you'll be creditworthy again. The markets will be willing to lend to you.
Yeah, so this does sound like as a model, a personal bank account that you have personally, or your business has to run in the green, or it can run in the red for a while, as long as you can support your debt. Someone like Amazon, Bezos famously did this for 20 years before they made any money, and now they're one of the richest companies in the world. But somehow I get the sense that countries are different because they can print their own money by fiat without a gold standard. So they just say, well, our money's valuable and here's why, or whatever they say. So countries are not quite the same as a business or a personal accounting, right?
Exactly. Countries can't, there is no formal bankruptcy procedure in the world for countries. So what happens when countries are effectively bankrupt means that nobody will lend any new money to them. And so they stop paying their debts, but nobody will lend them new money. And then that eventually becomes too painful. And then there's a process by which the people who had lent you money in the past usually take what is referred to as a haircut in the business. So they might not be paid, they might not be paid dollar for dollar what they lent, but they'll get 20% less, which is essentially what happened with Greece, is that the people who had lent to Greece weren't repaid the amount in full. They were paid a bit less. And in exchange, they lent more money to Greece, which then enabled Greece to get back on its feet.
So at the crisis point, the country is simply unable to pay its own employees, the police and fire and the people that run the government?
Well, it varies a lot by country in terms of how severe the crisis is, but usually it means having to cut back on spending or to raise taxes. And in Greece's case, they had to restructure their pension system. They had to try and raise more revenue and raise taxes because a lot of people were evading their taxes. And so it usually takes a combination of measures to try and recover from a crisis like that.
There's this, I'm sure you've seen the clock in New York City, the debt clock, how much debt the United States has and how much each of us individually and as a family owe. Well, who do we owe that money to?
It's interesting. We mainly owe it to each other and a bit to the rest of the world. Because all the people around the world who are holding U.S. Treasury bonds are ones who hold that debt. People do get very worried about debt, and especially these days in the context of COVID, when governments around the world have borrowed huge amounts to cope with the pandemic and the crisis. But there are times when it's very appropriate to take on a lot more debt, like a crisis like this. I think the other thing that's important to remember is that we're in a moment when interest rates are very, very low. And so for the advanced economies, for the rich countries in the world, their debt levels have gone up massively, but the interest that they have to pay on that has fallen by half. So if you think this way, that if you have a mortgage, you might be able to, in a low interest rate environment, that your monthly mortgage payment is actually less, even though the house you are living in is more expensive and the debt is higher on it. So in a time of low interest rate, it probably makes sense to borrow in a crisis.
And the thinking with modern monetary theory, which I haven't studied very closely, is that as long as the economy is growing, maybe 2-3% every year, you can afford to take on trillions of dollars of debt, say the 2 trillion we did for COVID. And then, Biden just announced he wants another 2 trillion for infrastructure. Okay. Why is this not going to lead to 1930s, 1920s Germany and runaway inflation?
So, your summary of the theory is exactly right. As long as your economy is growing faster than the interest rate, that the growth rate of the economy is higher than the rate of interest, you should always be able to repay the debt. The problem is you're assuming something there, that your economy is going to keep growing at a high rate, and two, that interest rates are going to stay low. And both those things could change. I think that rule of thumb may apply for the moment, but it might not apply forever. So you have to be prudent in terms of extrapolating, what the investment people say, current trends don't necessarily predict the future. So one has to be a little bit careful.
Yes, well, so one argument is that here by liberals, or at least progressives like Bernie Sanders, that we should be able to afford to give everybody $1,000 a month, universal basic income, UBI. And of course, conservatives push back against that. Well, we can't keep, the government can't just print checks and send them to people. Well, apparently the government can do that. It just did that. Yeah, but it can't do it forever. So this is what you're saying. We have to watch that future.
Absolutely. And on universal basic income, I'm a bit of a skeptic, to put
Really?
Which I think you would appreciate. I am because first of all, you have to give people a meaningful universal basic income. You have to raise taxes massively by 20-30%, which would be very, very difficult. And then you would have to churn all those tax revenues through the state and then allocate it to people who don't really need the money. And so most countries that have a reasonable welfare system are capable of targeting the money to those who need it the most, which makes more sense. But there's also a more profound reason why I'm not a huge supporter of universal basic income, is because I think work is a key part of the social contract, that all of us as able-bodied adults are expected in every society to contribute when we are adults, and we are in exchange looked after when we're young and when we're old. And I think if you take away that work, which is a key contribution to society that adult makes, I think the social contract breaks down.
Well, let's go back because your book talks about the social contract. Again, its title is what we owe each other, a new social contract for a better society. So I thought in the book you were kind of leading up to a UBI type argument, but you're not. So just take us back historically. This is a new idea. 500 years ago, states were, everybody was relatively poor. States owed their people next to nothing other than maybe military protection or something like that. So where does this idea of a social contract come from, and how did we get to where we are now?
No, you're absolutely right. So the social contract is a concept that has evolved sort of after the Enlightenment and with Rousseau to start, where the idea was that we had to, as people lived collectively, you needed some rules that governed that collective living. And people had expectations increasingly over time that were more than just, I want my feudal lord to protect me from invasion from the neighboring feudal lord. And those expectations resulted from living in cities, for example, as people urbanized. They expected water and sanitation and roads, and then over time, education and healthcare and various other things. And as those expectations for what people wanted to be shared collectively, you had to have some rules that governed how you pay for it and who's entitled to it. And so probably the biggest step in terms of revolutionizing the social contract happened after World War II. When in the US you had the New Deal, in the UK you had the famous Beveridge Report. Beveridge was one of my predecessors as director of the London School of Economics. And he wrote a report which basically said, everyone should be entitled to healthcare, and we're going to create a national health service. And if you're unemployed, the society should look after you until you find a job. And when you get old, everyone is entitled to a minimum pension. And that report was hugely influential. It influenced countries around the world in rethinking what the role of the state is. Now, during the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, the pendulum swung the other way. People felt that the welfare state had gotten too big, that the incentives for efficiency and dynamism were too weak. And there was that era that we all know well of privatization, liberalization, deregulation. And that really dominated economic policy throughout the 70s, 80s, and 80s. I think now people are looking for something different. I think the current social contract is broken because of a couple of key things. First, why do I think the social contract is broken? We see evidence of it around the world. The US is probably an extreme example in many ways. We see it in political polarization. We see it in rising inequality. We see it in the culture wars. We see it in the climate strikes. We see it in the fact that 4 out of 5 people around the world think the system isn't working for them. So that tells you something is profound. I think the reason it's wrong, was profoundly wrong, is driven by a couple of things. One is technology, which is changing work fundamentally, and people are now in jobs that are more flexible and more insecure. And second, I think the changing role of women is key, because now more and more women are in the workplace. And the old social contract assumed that women would look after the young and the old for free. And with working women, the issues around childcare and the issues around elderly care have become much more acute in most countries, as women can no longer do that. So I think those are the two fundamental drivers for breaking the social contract. And going forward, we've got more challenges: automation, climate, which I know you've thought a lot about, climate change, and so on. So the book really tries to say, how can we develop a social contract that will keep the benefits of capitalism and the dynamism that it brings, but address this fundamental issue about insecurity and the lack of opportunity that is fueling the frustration in many of our societies?
Well, as you know, conservatives, they love that era you just described, the 1980s, Reagan, Thatcher. They long for that. So here's the quotes from your book. From Margaret Thatcher: there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look after themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then to look after our neighbors. So let me just stand in for the typical conservative here who would say, look, I'll take care of me and my family. You take care of yours and your family. Okay, maybe we need a little bit of welfare for, mentally retarded people or people who physically cannot work because they're injured or whatever, homeless. We got to, okay, just a little. But other than that, just you do your thing, I'll do my thing. Okay, what's wrong with that?
I'll tell you. So people have a misconception that the welfare state is about redistribution of income. You take money from the rich and you give it to the poor. Actually, that's only about a quarter to a third of what the state is for. The more important role is what I would call the piggy bank function, which is transferring income across our own lives. So if you have a clever child, can't go to a bank and say, can you lend me money for my education? And I'll pay you back when I get a job. It doesn't work that way. That's what the state does. The state says, I will pay for your education as a child. And then when you become an adult and get a good job, you'll pay taxes. And then when you get old and are a pensioner, and if you're not earning enough, I'll make sure that you have the minimum for a decent old age. That redistribution of income across our own lives is actually the most important role of the welfare state. And we all need that. And especially since we're living longer, and especially since, because of automation, we need a different approach to education that supports people very early and also throughout their lives. The shape of that redistribution has to change. I'd say one other thing to the traditional conservatives. So I try really hard in the book to avoid being put in an ideological box, because once you're in one box, everyone in the other boxes stops listening to you. And so the reason I use the term social contract is the social contract is actually includes the welfare state, but it also includes the behavior of individuals, the role of communities and voluntary groups, as well as the role of employers. And so the social contract exists between all those parties. The welfare state is just one way that we can provide collective benefits. But societies take different approaches. I'll just give you an example, old age care. So some countries say that after you reach a certain age, the state will provide you with a minimum pension to avoid destitution in old age. Other countries, say Germany or Singapore or Japan, say once you're in your 40s, you must buy old age insurance for social care. So if you can't look after yourself when you're old, you have to have bought an insurance policy, which allows the market to solve the problem, so that you are not dependent on the states. So there are many ways to skin this cat. You can use markets. You can say these are responsibilities of individuals. You can say that the state will provide some support. My main argument in the book, though, is that we have to acknowledge that our current system isn't working, and we need to actually have a debate about what the alternatives should be.
So would an analogy be something like we all benefit from an interstate highway system because all of our products are delivered and we all get to drive on it, and it's hugely time saving. And so each of us gets a little bit richer over decades because of the interstate system. Well, Jeff Bezos isn't going to build the interstate system, right? Or Bill Gates or whatever. This is a government kind of project. And so in a way, we're investing in our future selves and our children's futures and grandchildren and so on because of the interstate. So a public school system would be like an interstate or something like that. Such that when Obama gave that famous speech where he said, you didn't build that, and he talked about these kinds of things. Silicon Valley people, they drive on public roads to get to Apple and Google headquarters or whatever. And, public education, they're hiring programmers that learn to program at state universities or something like that. And maybe you had help along the way. You had a mentor that nudged you in this direction rather than that direction. This is all true, but conservatives' heads exploded when they heard that, because what they hear is, I didn't build my own company. Yes, I did. I get up every morning and I go to work and I work hard, and so I'm a self-made person, so I deserve the money I make. So there's this kind of tension between conservatives tend to have a just world theory. The poor are poor because they're lazy. They're not creative. They don't work hard, and the rich are rich because of all these good virtues. And yet, in reality, it's not that simple.
Not at all. And actually, I think more important than the opening line of the book is society is everything. People think they might be self-made, but all of us are the product of the schools we happen to go to, the place where we happen to be born, the parents, the opportunities that our parents had. The huge element of luck in all of our lives is important, and we have to acknowledge that. One of my favorite pieces of research that we've done at the London School of Economics is called Lost Einsteins, and they use U.S. data, and they take kids in fourth grade who have exactly the same maths and science skills across the United States, and they look at what happens to them in later life in terms of how many patents and innovations they are responsible for. And what they find is that a kid who's born into a wealthy family that happens to live in, let's say, Silicon Valley or the bit of Minnesota where all the medical devices are invented, that kid is 10 times more likely to have patents than a kid who happens to be born in a poor family in a poor neighborhood, even though in fourth grade they have exactly equivalent math and science grades. So what it shows is that if we could get those kids born into poor families or into parts of the country where there are fewer opportunities, if we could get them to invent at the same rate as the kids into rich families, we could quadruple the rate of innovation and productivity in the economy. So there's also a very positive agenda here of taking advantage of all of that potential that is there that's not being used.
So one argument for standardized tests like the SAT is it may pluck out the Einstein that's in this poor public school that no one notices, and then, okay, let's send him off to this really great university and let him go. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on standardized tests and that way versus upgrading that crappy school that he's in so that he can do it right there rather than having to go off somewhere else.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think in the long run, upgrading the crappy school is probably a better strategy because the benefits are potentially much, much greater, and the number of kids who get plucked out is just so few. So I think doing systemic change is really important. The other thing that I think is very important is, we know now that the first 1,000 days of a child's life are the most important for brain development. And whether they get good nutrition and intellectual stimulation before they ever even get to a school is the most important for the long run. There's a really nice study that was done in Chicago where they had kids who were just visited by a community health worker and participated in, play sessions with young kids, and they checked on their nutrition before they ever got to school. Those kids, 20 years later, earned more, didn't depend on welfare, committed fewer crimes. And these very low-cost interventions early in life that equalize opportunities for children who happen to be born to parents who may not have parenting skills, who may not have the resources. Those programs, things like Head Start, have huge payoffs. And I also think will be key in a world where we have automation, where jobs are going to change a lot, and people are going to have to work much, much longer. And so you need to, get very good brain development early on in life. In the end, my book is actually less about redistribution and more about what economists call pre-distribution. Invest in people early in their life and give them opportunities. And if you get that right, you never have to redistribute income later because they'll be able to earn themselves.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell always makes the point that redistributing income is a false idea because it was never distributed in the first place, from on high. Like there's some income czar that, kind of lays it all out for everybody. It's just done from the bottom up. So what you're arguing is that's probably right. And so we have to not just redistribute income that was never distributed in the first place, but to make the work, the environment more prosperous for everybody. And this is your social contract. So let's just talk about the moral element of the social contract. Here's a typical conservative argument. I'm quoting here Dinesh D'Souza, who's a prominent conservative intellectual here in the United States, big Trump supporter now and so forth. And so here's his argument. I've heard him make this when we've debated on the origins of morality in secular versus religious communities and so forth. And that so if you're a poor person and I'm walking by you and I have a sandwich and you say, "Can I have half your sandwich? I'm hungry," and I give you my half sandwich, and you thank me. Now that's a voluntary exchange. I feel good, like I helped somebody that needed help, and you feel good that you got some help, and there's kind of a moral element to it. But no, so Dinesh continues. So now a third party comes in and says, "All right, Shermer, you're giving me half your sandwich, and I'm going to give a quarter of the sandwich to this poor person, and I'm going to keep a quarter for processing the transaction." And now, not only does the poor person only get a quarter rather than a half, I feel like I've just been robbed. Instead of voluntarily and morally, the moral element is taken out of the equation. I mean, this is super oversimplification, but this is kind of the typical conservative sense. Like, the government is stealing from me. I earned it. And they're giving it to this person. So the person doesn't even feel like there was a moral exchange.
So I think the key difference between those two stories is the role of democracy and society. So in that exchange where I give half my sandwich, it's a bit like with philanthropy. I'm a rich person. I choose where I want to give my charity. But on the other hand, I live in a society, and that society, there's a sort of randomness to that kind of the guy I ran into on the street who I give half the sandwich to. Maybe there's somebody in society who's a lot more needy than that person I happen to run into, who I don't run into. And so, isn't it better that we have a system where we as a society decide through the democratic process what should determine who gets the half sandwich? And maybe what should determine it is you should be the most needy. And maybe that if you get that half sandwich, it comes with a condition that actually you have to go to job training. So you get the half sandwich, but you have to go to let's say an apprenticeship program so that you can buy your own sandwiches in the future. And shouldn't we decide democratically rather than leaving it to the whims of individual rich people, depending on what particular fancy they have for a charity on a particular day? So that's the moral basis, I think, is it's linked to the role of democracy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other argument you hear, so we can talk about history a little bit, from conservatives is that before the Great Society, or say before the New Deal in the 30s and the Great Society in the 60s, there was much more charity. So, what about the poor people and the guy doesn't have a sandwich? Well, private charity. This is what churches do. This is what nonprofits do. This is their job. And they were doing it just fine until the Depression, and then Roosevelt, and then Johnson and the Great Society in the 60s, and that messed it all up. And now, charity is no longer able to, private charity is no longer able to do that job.
Yes. Well, and so it's interesting when you look at how that charity worked. So in the UK, for example, they had something called the Poor Laws, which meant that every local parish, every village was responsible for its poor. And the consequence of that was that there was huge unevenness in outcomes. If you happened to live in a village where there was a nice feudal lord who happened to want to share the wealth a little bit, you did okay. But in the majority of cases, you got very little. And so in most modern societies, there's a feeling that relying solely on private charity just results in too much unevenness and inequity, which is why we come together to pool our resources. It's also more efficient. Pooling resources for things like healthcare or pensions is actually more efficient than relying on lots of individual investments. For public health reasons, for all sorts of reasons, for financial efficiency reasons. If you run a pension fund that's bigger, the administrative overhead is actually much lower than if you run a pension fund that's very, very small. I know because I've done it, and there are economies of scale and in some of these things. So I think that I don't want to be too negative about private charity, because I think private charity should be honored and celebrated. But I think it can't substitute for providing an absolute minimum to everyone to have a decent standard of living.
Just not big enough. There's just not enough money in private charity. Yeah. Because the numbers, the last I looked at it, was like about 20, maybe 18 to 22% of GDP is allocated for these kinds of social programs and welfare and Social Security and healthcare and whatnot in most, let's say, the top 20 Western democracies, industrialized democracies. And everybody complains it's either too much or not enough, but it's always around 20%, even in America. I mean, I think America is like 21%. We allocate more than Canada, so-called, socialist Canada. So apparently that's just kind of the evolution of societies. That's the direction we're going, which is the point of your book, is that we should keep doing more of that.
Yeah. And we should do it in ways that adapt to the changing world that we're in. So, for example, I'll just give you two examples of that. One is parental leave, and because of women working. It was a huge fight to get maternity leave, although the U.S. is the only advanced economy in the world that does not have a federally mandated maternity leave, which is extraordinary. But what we should be doing is providing parents with parental leave. And I I really don't understand why. Well, I do understand the history why, but it doesn't make sense anymore when people are less attached to one employer throughout their lives to make employers carry the cost of maternity leave. Why isn't that funded general taxation so that men and women face a level playing field in the labor market? And small businesses who it's much harder for them to pay the costs of maternity leave, it would be fairer to them. So that's an example where society's changed. Women are working. We have this old model of maternity leave. It really doesn't fit our societies anymore. Why don't we move to a model where we provide parental leave to both parents, paid for out of general taxation, and relieve employers of that burden, and create a system whereby more women could stay in the labor market? That's just one example of where our current social contract doesn't fit our modern society. Same with education. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that our old model was everyone gets educated from about age 6 to your early 20s, and then you're done, and then you work, and then you work, and then you retire, and then you die. The problem is that the period of working is going to get much longer for most people. I mean, our children will work, the model that you get all your education into your 20s and then you work for about 30 years. Okay, that's about plausible. If you're going to work for 50 years, the idea that education you got from age 6 to 22, let's say, is sufficient to last you for 60 years is mad. And so we need an education system that lets people go in and out throughout their lives to retool and reskill. And so that's another example where we need a different kind of social contract. We need to fund education differently so that adults can go back and reskill in their 40s and 50s in order to stay relevant and be able to continue to work and pay taxes and contribute to society.
How would this work, like with the maternity leave thing? Let's say you're an employee at Google or whatever, and you get pregnant. So you say, okay, give birth. I get 8 weeks off or 10 weeks off. Now, Google's not going to pay your salary anymore. The government's going to pay it, something like that. I mean, who does this? What would be a working model of this?
Yeah, I think you could do it so that the government would pay the salary for that period, and you would say that either parent could use this leave to take care of a child. In Iceland, they have a system where they say the mother gets 4 months, the father gets 4 months, and then they have 4 months to share between them. And if the father doesn't take his 4 months, it's lost. And so suddenly a lot of Icelandic fathers, actually most Icelandic fathers, take paternity leave. And the kids benefit enormously from having their fathers around at a young age.
Yeah, I like to think fathers matter. Of course, I am one.
They matter a lot. And the research supports you.
Yeah.
Fathers really matter, really matter.
Well, then I guess the counter argument would be, well, that may work in Iceland. It's a small country. It's homogeneous. And so it wouldn't work in a gigantic country like the United States. Maybe it has to be a state, more local state policy rather than the entire federal government.
Yeah. I mean, I think that model is spreading in a lot of countries. I mean, you're right that a lot of them are small. So the ones that come to mind that have those sorts of generous parental leave policies are countries like New Zealand, the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, but also increasingly countries that have declining birth rates. So in Japan, Korea, for example, men can get 2 years of paid paternity leave because they're so desperate to encourage people to have children because their populations are declining. Now, that's not a problem the U.S. has at this point, but I think the U.S. could do much better in terms of parental leave rights, and in the long run, it's about keeping women in the workforce and the productivity gains that come from keeping women in the workforce. One of my great frustrations, and you see this everywhere in the world, there are now more women graduating from university than men worldwide, which is amazing when you think about it. And they go into the labor market and they earn the same as men until they have a child. And then once they have a child, the wage gap emerges and they shift to part-time work or they withdraw from the labor force. But those women are talented and productive and potentially huge contributors to society and to productivity of the economy. And if we can keep them in the labor market through better support to parents, we would all be better off.
You mean supporting part-time work while they're also parenting? Is that what you mean?
Well, or supporting both parents to work part-time, having more paid parental leave means they're more likely to go back into work. The countries that are the most successful at getting women back into work provide high quality public childcare in facilities in daycare centers. So France, for example, or in the old East Germany. In East Germany, I think 95% of infants were in daycare, and women all went back to work because there was high quality publicly funded daycare centers. So if you really want to get women back into the workplace, daycare centers rather than maternity leave is the way to do it.
But then wouldn't that be countered by your argument that parents matter the most? They're the ones that love their kids the most and want the best for them. So it's better that we fund them to stay at home, or at least one of the parents.
Well, no, that's so. What the research shows, and this is delving into very controversial terrain, but what the medical research and the science research shows is that parents really matter in the first year. Really matter. In fact, fathers and mothers really matter in the first year. But after the first year or so, first year to 18 months, it's really good for children to play with other children, to get to know engage with other adults. And so the studies show that children who are in daycare or after the first year and a half perform better in terms of educational outcomes and social and emotional behavior than children who are at home. And it's quite interesting. Germany at one point increased the maternity leave entitlement from, I think it was 1 year to 2 or 3 years to try and encourage mothers to stay at home with the logic of it's good for children for their mothers to be at home with them. And they actually found that educational attainment fell as a result. So I would say really important for the first year and a half, but then after that, exposure to other children, exposure to teachers, exposure to having to interact is really good for kids.
It takes a village, as Hillary said. Well, but there are arguments. Trying to remember, Laura Betzig, I think, the evolutionary psychologist, talked about, in hunter-gatherer communities, everybody helped out raising the children, or in kibbutzim, something like that. Now, okay, so again, the kind of conservative argument against this would be, what do you do about free riders, people that are, married to women that are married to the state? Reagan famously talked about welfare queens, and the moment you start giving these single moms money, then they're never going to get married to their guy. They're just then the check dries up, so they're just going to keep having babies out of wedlock because the government's paying them to do so.
I mean, I think it's interesting that even among poor families, mothers going back to work is good for children. And so, because it reduces the financial insecurity in the family. And so I guess what I'd say is, paying enough so that they can stay with children when they're very young, but then really encouraging or making it a requirement that you go back to work as soon as the children reach a certain age. I think that's good for the children and good for the mothers and good for the family. Some of these welfare schemes, if you look at what the Danes call workfare, it's very generous if you lose your job. And it's important to remember these are not rigid systems. So in the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, people lose their jobs all the time. In fact, they have really high rates of churn in the labor market. People lose their jobs. They have the highest rate of labor turnover in Europe. But if you lose your job, you get quite generous unemployment insurance. So you're paid like 80% of your previous wage, roughly speaking. But you must go into training. And if after a year and a half, your training is complete and you haven't found a job, you will be placed in a job. So the option of just being dependent forever is just not there. But the flip side is you get a lot of support so that you get skills and maintain your standard of living and get back into work really quickly. And that system seems to work incredibly well. They have the lowest, they have the highest rates of employment in the world.
So you would argue as an economist, it's better for the economy and for individual, let's say, per capita GDP as a measure in the long run if we do these steps rather than just let people fend for themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Not rather than let them fend for themselves or just make them dependent and accept that dependency. I think there's a better option. I think we can have labor markets that are flexible and competitive, but at the same time provide some security and support for people.
You talk about choice architecture in the book a bit, and like Cass Sunstein and Dick Thaler. I've been influenced by them, in terms of, because they make the argument: look, you're making choices one way or the other, and you're not really as free as you think you are. You have to get healthcare one way or the other, or you're going to put into a pension plan at work, and we know from studies people are really bad at discounting the future too much and making the wrong investments. And economists know these are the like 5 best investment tools. So here they are. When you sign on to work for this corporation, you pick one of the 5. So you get to choose. So they call this, somewhat ironically, libertarian paternalism. So this will appeal to conservatives and libertarians. Hey, you still get to choose. And yet the government or the corporations can say, look, research shows that like people are going to most likely pick this really bad investment tool over here. So let's give them 5 much better ones, super risk taking versus very conservative in risk. And then you get to pick.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do talk about that, especially in healthcare, but also pensions. So in pensions, for example, making people sign up for a pension as the default rather than having them actively have to choose to sign up makes a huge amount of sense, because there's just huge inertia. People tend to just go with the default option, and that's good for them to be able to be in a pension scheme so that they have some security in old age. Same in healthcare. Having nudges like having, the fruit at eye level in the supermarket and the candy at the bottom. It's really good. People will eat better diets if you let that happen. I think the same with taxing bads like cigarettes and alcohol. It does affect consumption. If people, people, of course, they should be free to drink, and if they want to smoke, they can. But it's hard to say that someone who's addicted to cigarettes is free. I don't quite see that as being.
And also the idea, well, it's your body, do what you want, as long as it doesn't affect me. But in fact, this person decades from now who is a lifelong smoker is going to be a massive burden on the healthcare system, because as you point out in the book, it's like 90% of healthcare costs are in the last year of life or last 2 years of life. And we're all going to have to pay for that one way or the other.
Yes, exactly. And these nudges can be very powerful, and they're not a panacea. They're not the whole answer, but I think they're, if we can, especially with healthcare, there are all these new tools that are making it much easier. These wearable devices that can monitor people's behavior, monitor your heart rate and your activity levels, and can remind you to take your pills on time. Those are really powerful ways to get people to take better care of their health. And I think the healthcare area is one example where, it isn't just the state should solve the problem. A huge amount of healthcare is about individual behavior, but we can help people with individual behavior by supporting them with things like nudges or groups that help people quit smoking or losing weight or those kind of things, which do rely on individual behavior, and I think is also an important part of the social contract.
Yeah, the obesity problem here in the United States is stunning. It's like 2/3, 69% are either overweight or obese. This is why people like Gary Taubes, who I had on the podcast, who's pushing keto, or at the very least, get off sugar and carbs, because it apparently is not working. You know, the pyramid we've been told to follow for the last 50 years has resulted in this massive obesity problem. Maybe we should try something different.
Yes, yes. No, the obesity is a really good example of something that is very costly to individuals and to society as a whole. Um, and again, there are all sorts of ways that we could make it easier for people. You know, should junk food be so cheap? I'm not so sure. Uh, you know, are food deserts okay? Should there be some way to encourage, to make it easier for people to get access to better quality food? Um, and the incentives to exercise and be a bit more active. Here in the UK in the NHS, they're talking about sort of paying people to exercise, so because the payoff is to society as a whole is so high, of people and just in terms of quality of life. So I do think it's we're in a really weird moment in history. There are more people who are obese than malnourished in the world today, than starving.
I suppose it's a good problem to have compared to centuries ago when when the vast majority of people were poor. But it's still a problem to be solved. Again, maybe that would be one of the nudges. Would be you get a tax break if your body mass index BMI is less than 25 or whatever the cutoff is, something like that.
Well, actually, health insurers will often give you a discount if you exercise regularly on your insurance premium. So you're absolutely right. That's a really good example where insurance premia could be linked to BMI, or BMI is better than exercise, actually, because it's easier to monitor than whether people say they exercise regularly or don't smoke.
One of the debates over UBI here is to what extent automation is going to put people out of work. So one argument is that, so what? They'll find something else to do. Like, what happened to all the elevator operators? The little guy sitting there on his stool in the elevator, which floor, please? And then he takes you up there. Well, that's all done by computers now, and this decades ago. And where did they all go? Well, they went somewhere, that's not a problem. Well, someone like Andrew Yang says, all right, you're not going to take, 2 million truck drivers and taxi drivers and put them at Google and they're going to become computer programmers. This is just not how it works in the modern world. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think automation will not make jobs. It will make some jobs disappear, but new jobs will emerge. I am not. I don't believe the hype that we're all going to be unemployed and we're all going to need universal basic incomes to survive. I don't buy that. That's never happened in history. But I do think that we're going to have to help people transition to these jobs of the future. I sometimes, speaking very loosely, say that the jobs of the past were about muscles. The jobs today are about the brain. And the jobs of the future are going to be more about art. And robots and AI are going to do all the things that are repetitive and routine. But you're still going to need humans to complement that and do the other things. So the doctor is going to use AI to do diagnosis for breast cancer or eye disease. But you're still going to want to talk to a human being about your treatment plan. And as we know with modern doctors, it would be nice if the doctor had a bit more time to talk to you about your treatment plan. And not have to waste time taking your blood pressure and taking your temperature. And you're more likely to adhere to your treatment plan if you spend a bit of time with the doctor talking about it. And so you'll have a better health outcome. And so I think we need to think about the jobs of the future in that way as complementary to the AI. Now, there are people who will be in jobs now that will disappear. I mean, the truck drivers is a really good example, people who do data entry, but also things like architects and lawyers and accountants. There are huge parts of their job that will be automated. I think we have to think about what are the jobs of the future. And I know it's hard to imagine sometimes, but there will be a huge increase in demand for people to look after the elderly, for example. And those kind of roles are ones that require emotional intelligence and some technical skills. But couldn't I know it may sound a bit strange, but couldn't a truck driver retrain to be a care worker or and why not? And so I do think we have to be a bit more open about what people could transition to.
Yeah, I'm still not convinced the self-driving technology is just around the corner. I mean, we've been told this for a couple of years now. I have a Tesla, and I have the latest model, and the self-driving feature, the semi-self-driving feature, is great on LA freeways. I just get over the left lane, I double-click the thing, the steering wheel takes over. I could listen to an audiobook or a podcast or whatever and kind of space out, no problem. But the moment I get off the freeway, navigating streets, or like where I live in the mountains up here above Santa Barbara, if I double click on the self-driving feature on a mountain road, forget it. I mean, it can't really do it very well. Any kind of sharp bend in the road, it slows way down, and the people behind me are pissed. And so I never use it except on that one feature. And this idea that in by 2025 this is all going to happen, I don't think so. I think it's long enough away that we'll solve these other problems incrementally without having to have some massive program to solve that problem.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, part of the problem is as long as there are other humans on the road, self-driving is a bit of a problem. But I think you're right. I think we've got a bit of time to figure that one out.
Apes driving cars, yes. What could go wrong? Okay, income inequality. This is another hot button issue. You're an economist. How big a problem is this? Everybody's worried about the Gini index. At the one end, you have the one person that has all the money in the world. The other end, everybody has the exact same amount. Of course, neither of these are the case. Where's the line? What's the right balance? And what's the fear if there's too much income inequality? What could go wrong?
So income inequality has definitely got worse in most advanced economies. The US is a pretty extreme case, and wealth inequality has gotten much worse. That's when you include not just people's regular incomes, but shares, assets, other things they own. And in the olden days, economists used to think you need some income inequality so that there'll be capitalists who invest, and it provides incentives for people to aspire to improve their lot. I don't think that view is very prevalent anymore, because I think that there's a realization that too much income inequality is actually associated with lower levels of economic growth. I think, though, the answer is around what I call pre-distribution rather than redistribution. Yes, you need a progressive tax system, and that's fine. But the problem, frankly, is that rich people are very good at evading taxes and finding ways to not pay as much as other people do. It's a real problem, because when I was at the IMF, we found the reason people pay their taxes is if they believe other people are paying their taxes. That's the most important driver.
So trust.
And as soon as you get the feeling that other trust is huge, that is the biggest driver. And if you look across the world at countries where tax compliance is high, it's in countries where people believe that other people are paying. And in the countries that you associate with tax evasion, it's because everyone thinks, oh, well, everyone's cheating. Why should I? I think I would do a couple of things. One, I would simplify the tax code and get rid of all those loopholes that make it possible for people to evade taxes. And so the simpler, the better. Two, I would, one of the most important drivers of inequality is the fact that many people are in jobs in which they don't get benefits anymore. And that has resulted in this spread of very low wage jobs. People are in work, but not earning enough to get by. And I think increasingly we have to look at forcing companies to pay benefits to workers, regardless of the nature of their contract. Just because I work part-time doesn't mean I shouldn't get any benefits. In the UK, just this month, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers are employees.
Oh,
I know
really?
that's been a debate.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. And I think my personal view is that we can, mandatory benefits for all workers in proportion to the number of hours they work is something we need to do. The third thing I would do would be more around the pre-distribution, investing more in education and training and so on. But we've talked about that a bit as well.
So the whole gig economy thing that's been evolving the last decade or so, due to the computer technology and apps and so on that make that possible, like Airbnb as well as Uber, you would apply that to across the board. Anybody that works any amount of time should get some kind of
pensions, health insurance, and
What about minimum wage? I mean, you always hear, we're moving now more toward, $15 an hour, that kind of thing. Every economist, at least every economist that appears on Fox News, says this is a disaster. People, the local McDonald's just won't hire the teenager because they can't afford to pay a teenager $15 an hour. So they'll invest and now you can walk into a McDonald's, the one down the street from me, there's an iPad there and you just touch what you want. So somebody's not getting paid. And this is the argument that McDonald's would just hire more iPads and computer programmers rather than pay the teenager $15. If I could pay him $10, I'd hire the teenager. That's the argument.
Yeah. I mean, minimum wages are minimum wages are, first of all, I think minimum wages are not enough to protect everyone because they're a minimum. They're not, some people who are not working will not benefit from minimum wages. So they only protect a proportion of the population. I think people used to think that, I often say undergraduate economics says you raise the minimum wage and everyone will be the unemployment will definitely shoot up. I think postgraduate economics is a bit more sophisticated than that because labor markets are very complicated and they don't necessarily work in that simple a way. One of the surprises is that many countries that have raised the minimum wage have not seen massive unemployment. If you look across U.S. states, for example, there are very different minimum wages across different states, but the unemployment rates are not massively different and sometimes don't go in the direction that you would expect. So I think that sort of simplistic, you raise the minimum wage and you'll have more. I do think you can't raise minimum wages infinitely, obviously, because if you do raise them really high, you will have unemployment. I also think that we need to think a little bit again about how we tax capital versus labor. I saw some very interesting work done by someone at MIT about how capital versus labor is taxed in the US. And what it shows is that we tax labor a lot. So if you employ someone, you have to pay Social Security and maybe some health insurance and so on. And the tax on labor is roughly, let's call it 25% on top of whatever the wage is. In the US, the effective taxation of capital is only about 5%. So what that does is it makes McDonald's want to buy more iPads because the amount of tax they pay on capital expenditures, on their investments, is much less than if they hired more teenagers. And so one of the arguments is we really need to rethink that and maybe try and level the playing field between capital and labor a bit more so that firms will make decisions in an economically rational way, not distorted against hiring more workers, which is what the tax system is doing now.
Yeah, and likewise with corporations that park their assets in foreign countries. I think Apple has a little office in Ireland or somewhere to avoid U.S. taxes.
That is truly an outrage.
Yeah.
I think the issue around international taxation is really extreme. Something like 91 companies in the Fortune 500 paid an effective federal tax rate of 0.
Unbelievable.
And that includes Amazon and Chevron and IBM, none of whom paid any federal tax in 2018. And I think you may have seen that the administration in the US is now arguing for a global minimum tax to try and deal with this issue of tax havens, and saying that you have to pay tax where the economic activity occurs. Just because you've got an office in Ireland doesn't mean you can book all your profits to Ireland. If you actually made the money in the US or the UK, you pay tax there, which I think all of us would intuitively makes sense. And that would have a huge consequence. I mean, that would raise hundreds of billions of tax revenues, which would be fair. The other thing about the global tax havens, which I find also terribly unfair, is it's really unfair to local companies. Companies that only operate in one country can't take advantage of global tax havens. And so it's really discriminatory to them.
It's amazing that they're able to do this. I mean, I guess I don't blame them because apparently it's legal. And so they're incentivized to do that. If a fifth of all Fortune 500 companies are doing it, obviously there's a reason they're doing that. So that change would have to come from the top down. That would have to be a federal tax law changes. But, these companies like Amazon and Google, they have the best lawyers in the world that are going to get in there and say, no, we're going to sue you, or you can't do this, or whatever. And so us little guys, what can we do?
Well, I think that's where we need good political leadership that looks out for the public interest rather than the interests of a narrow group. And, that's politics. But I think there is political momentum in that direction. I think people are sort of fed up of feeling that the system is unfair, and that many firms, their leaders, their corporate leaders and their shareholders are getting unfair benefit from the current rules on international taxation.
So, as you know, we're going through the BLM movement here in the United States, and I've been reading a lot of the anti-racism books and trying to understand their perspective. And one argument related to this generational wealth thing is that there's a massive black-white difference in generational wealth. Just in terms of white privilege, just as a white guy, I have more opportunities and so on and so forth. But economically, I haven't studied this close enough to fully understand it. But in terms of like how much property is owned, home ownership, and cross-generational wealth in blacks versus whites is massively different, like an order of magnitude different. So if that's true, assuming it's probably true economically, would this be an argument for reparations? And have you thought about, reparations economically? If we can afford something like a UBI or a bailout for during the pandemic and so on, the black community feels like, well, we were enslaved for 4 centuries and Jim Crow laws all the way up to the 60s before really we kind of started the clock. And President Johnson famously said, you can't bring an athlete to the start line who's been hobbled for his whole life and go, okay, you're free to compete now with all the other professional athletes. It's just not fair. And so there would be an argument for that. But the moment you go down that pathway, say in America, you guys in England, well, your colonial history is, not too good. Would you not then owe the people of India or wherever reparations because they have generational wealth gap and so forth?
Yeah. It's a really tricky issue. And I think that, as you say, the problem with reparations is where do you stop and how far back do you go? And I think it's a very problematic argument, especially when you bring it down to individuals. I think a better way to think about it is to think not backwards and about individuals, but look forwards and look at groups of people. One of the most interesting pieces of research I've seen looked at what happened to productivity in the US when changes in laws meant that women and Blacks were able to be treated equally in the labor market. And what it showed is that when that happened, US productivity massively increased because employers no longer just chose all their workers from a narrow pool of white men. They could pick the best person for the job. And sometimes the best person for the job was a Black person or a woman. And suddenly that opened up huge opportunities, but it also increased productivity because also some of the white men were also in the wrong jobs. And there were other jobs that they were better suited to. And so everybody. And so I think for me, focusing a lot on how do we equalize opportunities for people who are disadvantaged, be they Black people, be they women, be they disabled people, to maximize their opportunities going forward. I think that's an easier argument to make, and I think it's a more positive argument to make where you're more likely to get political support to do it because it's so clear that everyone benefits from using all the talent in society. And there is so much talent in those disadvantaged communities, be they Black communities or other groups that have been historically disadvantaged.
Yeah, you write in your book, humans really have never had it so good. And yet, in so many parts of the world, citizens are disappointed. And this has revealed itself in politics, the media, and public discourse. So, it's important we say what you just said, things have never been so good. And we still have a lot of work to do, which is sort of the point of your book.
Absolutely. Exactly. Right. No, you absolutely got it. That was the original motive for me writing this book because I was puzzled. I spent 25 years of my career in international development, going to some of the poorest countries in the world and seeing huge progress in my own life. When I went to some of the, in places in Africa where one saw levels of poverty that were appalling, and then you go back 20 years later to those countries and they've made huge amounts of progress. And yet, despite all this progress and this huge wealth that we see in our world, people are really unhappy and people feel disappointed. I also think the pandemic is a window of political opportunity. I think we're at a moment where people are reassessing things. And I saw some interesting surveys done across 24 countries, pre and post pandemic. And in that period, people feel more afraid. They feel more disappointed in society. They feel more risk averse. But at the same time, they also feel that they value solidarity more and relationships and equality and freedom, and they're less materialistic. And so I think this is a moment when a lot of people will reassess what they want out of their own lives and what they want from their society. And so I'm hoping this book has a bit of impact shaping that thinking.
Oh, I think it should. Absolutely. Here, I think about the hedonic treadmill as one explanation that, to say to somebody who is relatively poor in England, yeah, well, if you lived under the Henry VIII regime, centuries ago, you'd be way more miserable. So be happy. Well, but I don't live then. I'm not comparing myself now to how my fellow countrymen lived 500 years ago, whatever, and so one argument about this kind of increasing wealth is that it's just going to lead to this kind of hedonic treadmill where everybody's just constantly, I got to have a bigger house and a bigger house. Well, on average, houses are, like twice the size they were in my father's time. But I don't compare my house to my father's house. I compare it to the guy across the street there, right? So, that may never end.
That is one of the problems with poverty reduction. In the people since I worked on that for many, many years, poverty is not an absolute concept; it's a relative concept. So people consider poverty not exactly as you said. It's not I earn X amount of income, and if I reach $30,000 a year, I'm not poor anymore. Actually, it is relative to others, which is why inequality is a challenge, because it means that a lot of people feel really poor, even though in absolute terms they might not, but in relative terms they feel hard done by.
Yeah, you write here of your new social contract first that everyone should be guaranteed the minimum required to live a decent life. This minimum should include basic health care, education, benefits associated with work, and a pension that protects against poverty and old age, with the level depending on how much society can afford. Second, everyone should be expected to contribute as much as they can and be given the maximum opportunities to do so with training throughout life. Later retirement ages and public support for childcare so women can work. And third, the provision of minimum protections around some risks such as sickness, unemployment, and old age are better shared by society rather than asking individuals, family, or employers to carry them. So you've articulated that argument in this conversation quite well. But just what if we reach that level and all this is going great and everybody goes, hey, I want more. This is not enough.
Yeah, if you achieved all the things I've said there and they still want more, well, I guess, there is a big debate in economics about how we measure progress. And there are a lot of people who've argued that, GDP is not a very good measure, income is not a very good measure. And these broader measures of well-being are really what's important to people. And I do think that, and again, in the wake of this pandemic, I do think that is getting a lot more traction all over the world. It's very interesting. When you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? And when you ask them what it is that determines whether or not they're satisfied, it's very similar. It's very striking how universal it is. The things that matter most to people, first and foremost, is health, both mental and physical. Second, the quality of their relationships. And third, if they have meaningful work. If you're unemployed, divorcing, and sick, you're pretty miserable. And that is a universal truth. One thing I always tell politicians is, people often have this cliche about, it's the economy, stupid, people vote their pocketbook. And so politicians are often focused on, GDP has to go up during my tenure and then I'll get reelected. Actually, what the research shows is the biggest determinant of whether I reelect someone is if my well-being improved during their tenure. If I was healthy, I had good relationships, and I had meaningful work. If those things improve, I'll reelect you. And so I'm hoping that more and more politicians will clock on to this and realize the things that really matter to people.
Well, Minouche, we've been going an hour and a half, and I know you have a real job, unlike me, that actually makes a difference. So, but let me just ask you one last question. When I was researching the moral arc at the end, I wanted to project it to the future. So I read a book called Trekonomics, which is basically, let's say in the 23rd or 24th century, everyone has so much prosperity, we don't even need money anymore. It's like you go to the replicator in Star Trek and you say, Earl Grey hot, and you get the tea and it makes the cup, the whole thing. Now, this is pretty speculative, but, if you take like GDP growth, per capita, whatever measure over the last 4 centuries, and you extrapolate that out another 4 centuries, we're all going to there'll be no more poverty. I mean, poverty's allegedly, I guess, going to end by 2030 or 2040, according to the UN less than $2.90 a day, no one will be below that level. Not that that makes them prosperous. If they make $4 a day, it's still pretty poor. But anyway, let's just say everybody has plenty. Is that even possible, or is this just science fiction?
It's interesting when you look in history at economic progress. We didn't make much economic progress for, I don't know, the first 5,000 years of human history. It's really only in the last couple of hundred years that we have seen this massive increase in people's income and well-being. So can this go on for a few more hundred years, and um, can we see poverty completely disappear? What would I say to that? I guess I'd say I think, there are some big risks out there, the climate, future pandemics, those kind of things. But if we do mitigate those risks, I do think that we can see a world in which almost everybody has the minimum for a decent life. I do think that is feasible in the future. We have to avoid, some of the potential big risks out there. And it's not going to be like a linear process. Climate is a really good example where there may be quite a few people displaced in the world as a result of climate change, where bits of the planet are no longer habitable. And that will be a very disruptive process as people move around. But on the other hand, we do have resources that are able to accommodate that if we manage them well. In my own lifetime, I've seen massive progress in and I'm not that old. I'm 58. But I've seen
to be 50 again.
But I'm sure you'd say the same.
Yeah.
Massive
Totally.
improvements around the world. And so I am fundamentally optimistic about your question.
Yeah.
I do think it's, we have to avoid doing really stupid things. But if we avoid doing really stupid things, I think we can reach a world in which there's very little poverty, if any.
Well, I loved your book. I think the new social contract is within reach, even in our lifetime. Every member of Congress and Parliament should read your book. Absolutely. What's next on your big writing project or agenda or work?
Oh gosh. Well, it's it's a tough question. I think one of the things that the pandemic has made me realize that I need to think about more is what we owe to people in other countries. So the book is very focused on what we owe each other in society. But I think the pandemic has really raised the challenge of, the whole debate about nobody's safe until everyone is safe. And how do you define that, and how do you make that real, and what is the right amount of obligation to people in other countries, and how do you measure that? And, I spent a lot of my career in the international system and working at the World Bank and the IMF, and I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the current international system, which again was created in the post-World War II world to solve a different set of problems. And so I guess I'm beginning to think a little bit. You've triggered the thought about what should happen to the international system to manage the global challenges we face and what we owe each other across the world.
Yeah, the pandemic is a good model for climate change, perhaps, and also getting to nuclear zero would make me sleep a little bit better at night. That's also a potential threat. Much work to be done. And yeah, things can be done. I mean, it was just, what are we, April 8th today? It was maybe just 6 weeks ago that it looked like it was going to be like 3 years before everybody in America was vaccinated. And now it's like June. So like, how did that happen?
It's amazing, isn't it? I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. People have realized that if we really focus on something, we can get things done. And that's good. That's
Yeah.
good. That sense of feeling that we can do things is really good. A good counterpoint to the sense of despair and hopelessness that has dominated political discourse in recent years.
Yes. Well, I love your optimism and I love your writing, and thanks for the conversation, and thanks for your work, real work, work that's actually making differences. So I really appreciate the
Oh, well,
conversation.
thank you, Mike. Me too. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your wonderful questions. You really, like any good conversation, you made me think, and I think that's probably why your podcast is so successful.
Well,
You
thank
make
you.
people think.
Thank you. That's what we try to do here.